In the heart of Ibadan, a young woman named Sophie sat under a sprawling mango tree along a dusty road. Her clothes were worn thin from years of hardship, and her eyes, swollen from silent tears, stared ahead in despair. In her hand was a small nylon bag, her only meal of the day. But her hunger wasn't her biggest worry. At home, her younger brother Caleb, crippled since the accident that took their parents, waited with an empty stomach and a tired soul. As Sophie clutched the bag, whispering prayers to the sky, a frail voice startled her. An old woman with sun-beaten skin and tattered clothing stood before her, asking gently for a bite of her food. Sophie hesitated. Her brother hadn't eaten, and this was all they had. Yet something in the woman's weary eyes made Sophie kneel beside her and offer the warm plate of rice. The woman's tears fell freely as she whispered, "God bless you, child." Sophie didn't know that her simple act of kindness was about to unlock a future she never imagined. That evening, she returned to her one-room shack, where Caleb waited by the cracked window. His face fell when he saw she carried nothing. "I gave the food to someone who needed it," she explained, holding back tears. Caleb, ever understanding, hugged her. In that moment of shared hunger, hope still lived in their hearts. The next morning, Sophie dragged herself to a construction site where she worked carrying water for builders. The sun burned hot against the red earth, and each trip with the heavy bucket drained her. Her stomach growled, her legs trembled, and her fingers ached from overwork. She tried to keep up with the others, but hunger and exhaustion weighed her down like chains. By noon, she collapsed under a tree nearby, closing her eyes just for a moment. That moment turned into sleep, and when the supervisor, Mr. Amos, found her, he exploded with anger. "Sleeping on the job?" he yelled. Sophie jumped up, terrified. She begged for understanding, explaining that she hadn't eaten. But Amos had no patience for weakness. "You're lazy," he shouted. "Get out. No pay for today or any day." Shamed and broken, Sophie walked home under the blistering sun. Caleb met her at the door. She fell beside him, too tired to cry. "I lost the job," she whispered. Caleb, wise beyond his years, held her hand in silence. "We'll survive, Sophie," he said softly. But even as his words comforted her, Sophie stared at the cracked ceiling that night, whispering prayers into the darkness. "Lord, if you can see me, show me a sign." The next day, with no coins left in her purse and only hope in her chest, Sophie walked to a richer part of town in search of work. Her feet blistered from the long trek. As she passed a grand compound with trimmed hedges and tall gates, a small wooden board caught her eye. "Housekeeper needed apply within." Her heart skipped a beat. Sophie approached the gate, unsure. The security guard eyed her from head to toe and asked what she wanted. "I came for the job, sir," she said meekly. The guard shook his head. "Come back tomorrow morning. The Oja will want to interview you himself." Sophie thanked him and turned away, heart heavy but eyes hopeful. On her way back home, a familiar figure appeared on the dusty path. It was the same old woman she had fed. She was dragging a sack almost as heavy as her frame. Without thinking, Sophie rushed to help. "Mama, let me carry it," she said. The old woman's smile returned. "You again. Bless your heart," she said. As they walked together, the woman said, "My name is Deborah, but everyone calls me Mama D." Sophie smiled in return. "I'm Sophie," she replied. The two women continued down the road together, unknowingly bound by fate. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the house before 8 a.m., her hair combed neatly and her cleanest dress pressed. The guard let her in with a slight nod. On the patio sat a tall man with bright eyes and a calm presence. He introduced himself as Mr. Sampson. "So you want to be the housekeeper?" he asked, taking a sip of tea. Sophie answered with quiet confidence. Mr. Sampson laid out the job, clearly daily cleaning, laundry, and care of the compound. No overnight stay, just daytime duties. Sophie agreed, desperate for a way to support Caleb. Sampson watched her for a moment, then smiled. "You're hired," he said simply. Sophie was stunned. "Thank you, sir," she said, trying to hold back joyful tears. As she left the compound, her steps were lighter than they had been in years. When she reached home, she burst through the wooden door. "Caleb!" she cried. Her brother sat up quickly. "What happened?" he asked. "I got the job!" she shouted, kneeling to hug him. Caleb's eyes welled with tears. "You did it, Sophie. You really did it." For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, better days were ahead. Sophie started her work the next day with quiet dedication. She arrived at the compound just after sunrise, always greeting the security guard with a polite, "Good morning." Inside, she scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, and washed laundry with care. Mr. Sampson watched from the balcony, intrigued by her quiet efficiency. She didn't chat idly or complain, she simply worked, like the house was her own. So, one afternoon, Mr. Sampson returned home looking exhausted. As he entered the living room, something stopped him, a steaming plate of yam porridge on the table with a small note beside it. "I noticed you didn't eat lunch yesterday. Hope this helps. Sophie." Sampson stared at the note for a long time. Cooking wasn't part of her job. She had done it anyway. He sat down, touched the spoon, then smiled for the first time that week. "Who is this girl?" he whispered to himself. That night, Sophie returned home to Caleb. They shared gari and groundnuts for dinner, laughing softly as the breeze cooled their tiny room. Sophie didn't mention the food she left behind at work. She didn't need to. Her joy wasn't in recognition, it was in knowing she had done something kind. Caleb looked at her and said, "I think something good is coming for us." Sophie smiled, not knowing how right he was. That week, Sampson had a phone call with his mother. "Mama, when are you coming to Lagos?" he asked. "I miss you." His mother, firm and wise, replied, "I'll come soon, but there's something I must tell you." Sampson chuckled. "Let me guess, marriage talk?" She laughed. "You're sharp, but this time I've found someone. A girl with a rare heart. I've been watching her." Sampson was surprised. "You? Watching?" She replied, "You'll see." The next morning, Sophie was dusting the living room when Sampson walked in. "Please prepare the guest room," he said. "My mother's coming over." Sophie nodded, not knowing the weight those words would soon carry. Later that day, a knock came on the door. Sampson opened it with joy. "Mama," he said, hugging the visitor. Sophie looked up and froze. The woman at the door was Mama D. Sophie's hands trembled. She whispered, "Mama D?" The old woman looked equally shocked. Sampson stood between them, confused. "Wait, do you know each other?" Mama D walked in calmly. "Let's sit down," she said. In the living room, she revealed the truth. She had disguised herself to test the hearts of people. Sophie had passed her test in the most selfless way. Sophie sat speechless as Sampson looked from his mother to her, something new stirring inside him. After the truth came out, Sampson withdrew quietly into his room. He stood by the window, staring out at the orange sky of Lagos. He thought of Sophie's gentle ways, her quiet strength, her dedication even when she thought no one was watching. His heart beat harder than it had in years. "She wasn't doing any of it for show," he whispered. "She was just being Sophie." Back in the living room, Mama D comforted Sophie. "Your kindness didn't go unnoticed. The world may not always reward good people immediately, but God never forgets." Sophie wiped her tears and stood. "Thank you, Ma, but I must go. My brother needs me." Mama D followed her to the door. "You're a rare gem, my daughter. Be safe." Sophie walked away, not knowing that Sampson stood behind the curtain, watching her leave with a heavy heart. That night, Mama D joined her son. "You like her, don't you?" she asked. Sampson nodded slowly. "I do, but I don't want to force anything." His mother smiled. "Son, you're not forcing anything. Love doesn't need to shout. It speaks through actions, just like hers." Sampson looked down. "I'm afraid. What if she says no?" Mama D squeezed his hand. "She won't. When the time is right, speak your heart." The next morning, Sampson stood by the gate waiting. Sophie approached, unaware of what the day would bring. She greeted him politely and went inside. Sampson watched her as she worked, trying to find the perfect moment. Mama D sat in the kitchen, smiling to herself, knowing her son was ready to do something bold. Later that day, as Sophie finished wiping the windows, Samson called out, "Sophie, please come." She walked toward him, wiping her hands on her wrapper. He stood, looked at her, and then said calmly, "There's something I want to tell you." Her heart jumped. "Yes, sir?" she asked, voice soft. He stepped closer and said the words he had been holding for days. "I want to marry you." Sophie stood frozen. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Samson nodded, giving her space. "You don't need to answer now. Just think about it." Sophie nodded slowly, then left the house, her mind spinning. On her way home, she stared at the sky. "Could this be real?" she whispered. The stars blinked above, but gave no answer. Sophie didn't reply immediately. She took her time. She watched Mr. Samson closely over the next few days. She watched how he treated his staff with respect, how he helped his elderly neighbor carry her shopping, how he listened patiently to his mother. He wasn't just kind, he was consistent, and Sophie respected consistency. She also saw how he supported others. One day, a young staff member came late, trembling with fear. Samson accepted the apology, but advised him firmly. "Be responsible," he said, "but don't be afraid of mistakes." Sophie, listening from behind the kitchen door, smiled. He had power, yet never used it to hurt others. He reminded her of her father before the accident, strong but tender. At night, Sophie would lie beside Caleb and whisper her thoughts aloud. "He's a good man, Caleb. Maybe this is my second chance." Caleb smiled sleepily. "Then don't be afraid to take it." Sophie stayed quiet for a while, but her heart was no longer unsure. She had made her decision. It was time. One bright morning, Sophie arrived at the house wearing a flowing yellow dress. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her heart beat faster than ever. Mr. Samson looked up from the living room as she walked in. "Good morning, Sophie," he said. "Good morning, sir," she replied, standing before him. She took a deep breath. "I've thought about your proposal," she said, her voice steady. "And now I'm sure." Samson stood slowly, heart racing. "I will marry you," Sophie said with a smile. Samson beamed with joy. He pulled her into a gentle hug. At that moment, Mama D entered the room, saw them, and cried out, "Thank you, Lord." She danced around the house singing, "My son has found a wife." But the surprises didn't end there. Samson enrolled Sophie in an online university and surprised her with her own catering business. Sophie's Delight Kitchen. She cried when she saw the signboard. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He smiled. "Because you never waited to be rescued, you worked. And I want to support that." And just when Sophie thought life couldn't get better, the doctor announced that Caleb's surgery was fully paid for. Months later, Sophie walked down the aisle in a white gown. Caleb, now walking proudly beside her, carried her bouquet. Samson waited at the altar, his eyes full of love. Sophie smiled through tears. Her journey from hunger and heartache to hope and happiness was complete. But in her heart, she knew it had all started with one simple act of kindness. What's your take on Sophie's journey? Sophie's story reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can unlock doors we never imagined. From the dust of hardship to the light of love and healing, her journey is one of grace, sacrifice, and unexpected miracles. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Was it her choice to give away her only food, her unwavering care for Caleb, or the moment she realized Mama D's true identity? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your reflections in the comments below. Your voice matters. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, comment, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe and turn on notifications. More powerful African stories are coming your way. Thank you for watching, reading, and feeling with us. Until the next story, stay kind.